Hello folks, this is Mr. O'Brien and welcome to the video quiz for the American system, which is part of Key Concept 4.2, so let's get started. Alright, so the actual key concept itself is 4.2, Roman numeral 2, letter B. Despite some governmental and private efforts to create a unified national economy, north-southwest, most notably the American system, the shift to market production linked the North and Midwest more closely than either was linked to the South. So, in a nutshell, that means in this time period, 1800 to 1848, the American system was supposed to unite North, South, and West. Didn't happen quite that way. There were lots of improvements, not as many as we wanted. The North and the West wound up being BFF, and the South was kind of, So, let's get to it. Alright. Ooh, Henry Clay popped up early. Ooh, he's so handsome. Look, he's even striking a model pose in that second photograph. And also, since this American system is Henry Clay's, we should also take note that he is the original comb-over. Look at his hair. If not for him, we wouldn't have this. Alright, let's move on. The American system was Henry Clay's idea. Let's move on. Alright, some background info. During the early 19th century, the country was still growing and faced many challenges. U.S. industry manufacturing was in its infant stages, had a hard time competing with British goods. They had a head start. Our infrastructure was weak. The roads, bridges, canals, things like that, and navigation, transportation was weak, especially in the West, Kentucky, Ohio, Tennessee, etc. And the first bank, the first bus, expired, and at the beginning of this American system, the second one was being recommissioned, rechartered in 1816 for 20 years, and would expire in 1836. The American system was an attempt to address all three of those areas, which I say right here. So, number one, to address these three problems, we have what's called internal improvements, where we were going to, as a government, both on the national level and presumably on the state level, subsidize internal improvements, meaning improvements within our country internally. Roads, canals, bridges, whatever you have to increase transportation, make it easier to facilitate trade between the North, the South, and the Northeast. Okay, so internal improvements basically means, like today, repaving a highway. Like Route 57 was repaved. That's an internal improvement. All right. So that was in disarray prior to the American system, and the idea was to improve that through the American system. That would help facilitate trade between the three regions of the United States. Secondly, in 1816, with the support of James Madison, we institute a tariff, and the tariff was meant to protect domestic manufacturers. Just a foreign-produced good, if they wanted to be traded over here, would be charged a tariff, and then that tariff would then, would find itself in a greater price. So the customer would pay the cost of the tariff through a greater price. And that would make the foreign-produced good more expensive than the domestically produced good, thereby protecting the domestically produced good, domestically manufactured good. So a tariff protects domestic manufacturing by making the foreign good more expensive because it taxes the foreign good. So the second way we were going to do that was tariffs. The third way was to enact that second Bank of the United States, the second bus. All right. So there was opposition to parts or all of this plan based on region and view of the government. For the most part, the West liked this plan, at least the internal improvements part, because they were pretty unimproved out there. Didn't like the bank too much out there in the West. But the Northeast liked all of it. The Northeast liked all of this. The Northeast is where you found the artisans, so they liked the protection of domestic manufacturing. You also find the bankers and the merchants, so they liked the bank. Okay. The South opposed the tariff, they opposed the bank, and they opposed the taxes that came with internal improvements. So, did not achieve the unity it was supposed to. Alright, so this is kind of off the American system a little bit, but this is the short and quick history of the bus. Don't forget the first bus created divisions between Secretary of State Jefferson and Secretary of Treasury Hamilton in Washington's administration. There was a debate over how we should interpret the Constitution, strict or loosely. All right. So Jefferson lets the first charter of the first bank die out. Henry Clay becomes a very vocal supporter of the second Bank of the United States. And although the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the Second Bank of the United States in McCulloch v. Maryland, there was significant opposition to the Second Bank of the United States, especially in the name of Andrew Jackson, who becomes president in 1828. So ultimately, the bus ends in 1836 during Jackson's second term. He vetoes the second bank, the rechartering of the second bank. All right, let's get back to the American system. All right, so there was an argument about inter versus intra-state trade. What should the national government be allowed to do? The Constitution says only interstate trade between two or more states. Although there's intrastate trade, meaning trade within the state. So since Congress can't regulate intrastate trade, the question was, should Congress also fund intrastate internal improvements? So for much of early American history of our nation, meaning post-Constitution, early nation, Congress only provided funding for interstate developments, say a highway that would encompass two different states. All right, so this brings us to the Maysville Road veto, which I've mentioned numerous times, or will mention numerous times in this unit. Henry Clay sought funding from the national government in the 1830s for the Maysville Road the Maysville Road highway, and Jackson vetoed it because the Maysville Road was only going to be in Kentucky. So Congress was only going to fund interstate internal improvements, and most of the funding for internal improvements actually came from the states themselves. Okay? And since it's only in Kansas, this would be intrastate trade. I'm sorry, Kentucky. Only in Kentucky. All right, and as I said, Jackson vetoed it. Talk about in need of a comb-over. Jackson vetoed it because it was an example of an intrastate infrastructure. It's a tongue twister. Henry Clay was mad that Jackson vetoed his Maysville Road highway. So how would funding be provided for these internal improvements? Like I said, mostly from the states. And also tariffs. And they keep going up and up and up until they really annoy the South. And then we get to the tariff of abominations under Andrew Jackson. All right. So now we have tariffs and excise taxes. A tariff, as I said, is a tax on foreign goods. The price of a foreign good increases, providing revenue for the government, and it makes American products more appealing because they're less expensive, presumably. We have an excise tax, which is a tax on manufactured goods, such as whiskey. Remember the Whiskey Rebellion? Okay. Why was there a need for tariffs in the early 19th century? Okay. Because certain people didn't want the national government to fund intrastate internal improvements. Hence the national government's need to tariff to generate revenue to maybe help try and pay for these improvements. All right. Why were they needed? American industries were young, foreign goods were often cheaper, hence the tariffs, and Britain flooded the U.S. market after the War of 1812. During the war, there was no trade with Britain, and there were products were kind of just sitting there in England waiting to be traded. Once the war was over, they flood our market. And when there's more of a supply of something, the price goes down. Now, did everyone love tariffs? No. We will get to the nullification crisis. Talk about a good-looking fella, John Calhoun there. All right. We get to the nullification crisis with Andrew Jackson. We'll get to that. The South, in particular, was outspoken against tariffs. Again, that's Calhoun. All right. So, successes of the American system. The Northeast and the Midwest were more closely linked. Many states built up their infrastructures, roads, canals, yada yada. It was the first of many government-sponsored programs in the economy, and American industries were able to grow and prosper because they were protected to an extent by this American system. The failures: it did not unify all areas of the United States. Sectionalism increased, such as the nullification crisis, which we'll get to, where the South tried to void the tariff of 1832 and 36. So we'll get to that sectionalism. And another failure: continued debates about the role of federal government in intrastate business. Should they help fund it or not? Test tips. For the multiple choice questions and the short answer, be sure to know the following: that the American system attempted to help create a unified national economy, but ultimately did not succeed all the way. Know the North and Midwest benefited the most from the system. Opposition persisted, especially in the South. Be able to explain the various regional views of the economy and the market revolution, how it relates to all that. Remember, transportation was a big part in the market revolution. Reasons for these successes and the failures of the American system. Now, for the essay questions, you will not really ever get an essay question just on the American system. It'll be part of a broader topic, such as maybe regional differences during the antebellum era. 1820 to 1860 is the antebellum era. All right, so be sure to take the quiz that will pop up right now.